Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. My special guest today is someone who has become a regular on this program, and he is a friend of mine, and his name is Dan Mahala. Those of you who have watched many of my programs in the past have probably seen Dan before. Dan is a person of at least several passions. Among his passions are a passion for traveling, especially in Europe, a passion for reading, and a passion for jogging and running. Indeed, Dan has run 21 marathons in his life. Today, I'll be focusing on Dan's passion for reading. And in conjunction with that, we'll be talking about what he believes might constitute wisdom. You might want to grab a pencil or a pen, because later in the program, both Dan and I will be recommending some books. We'll be recommending books for those who are not avid readers, and also books for those who are avid readers. Dan, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
I mentioned that Dan is a passionate reader. For years, I used to regularly jog and run with Dan. I'd say for about 20 years, we ran together, and so often our conversations centered around books and ideas. In fact, many of our conversations I thought were thought-provoking because they were based on books. Dan, let me begin with this question. Why do you read so much? Because I mentioned before you are a passionate reader. I don't know if I've known anybody in my life who reads more than you do.
Yeah, I love reading. There's no question about it. I think it's one way we can expand our intellectual capabilities, certainly. But I read primarily to learn from other people's experiences, especially those that have done serious reflection on life over the centuries, those that have studied human nature, because ultimately, I think we all read, or what we really want to get out of it is know something about ourselves. And I think we do this through other people's experiences. Learning something about human nature in general is going to help us learn something about ourselves.
This is what attracts me to reading also. Of course, I find reading entertaining, as I'm sure you do, but I find even when I read something that is not productive of happiness in me, even when I read something sad, that if it's illuminating, if it teaches me something about myself, if it teaches me about other people, if it teaches me something about life, it's worthwhile and help to make my life more fulfilling.
Sure.
Specifically, what kinds of books do you like to read?
Well, I've changed over the years. Of course, as a younger person, I was more interested in adventure and history. Then I switched my interest to philosophy. Most recently, I've been trying to gather as much information as I can from the great authors of our time, and it's usually they exhibit their best thoughts and deepest ideas in their fiction. Sometimes autobiographies I like too, but certainly the fiction that we call the classics, I find that I can read and enjoy and dwell on over and over again and get a lot out of.
So you're very selective in what you read.
Very selective, yeah. I like, you know, it's not just by chance you're going to come across that great reading. I think you got to work at it, and I do. I'm very careful about what I choose to read and who I take my advice from on what to read and things like that.
I know in some of our conversations recently, you mentioned one of your guides to what you're going to read is a list the New York Public Library put out some years ago. In fact, I think I gave you
Yes,
the
you
list,
did. Yes, you did.
It's a list of what the New York City Public Library's executive board considers to be the best 100 books of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Broken down into categories, history and social commentary, etc.
Yeah, there are a couple of those lists that I've paid attention, and I want to thank you again for giving me that list. You know, when I'm looking for books or I'm ready to order some for the next period of time, I'll refer to that list and make sure that I've read most of them, and maybe order some that I haven't read about subjects that I'm not particularly interested in. But the books are so good. Now, when you say New York Public Library Executive Board, they have a huge research center, and they're looking at what to provide in a library and how to, you know, provide the right information for the right people. And also there was a modern library, has its 100 best books of the 20th century. I think these are good guides to fall into. And I also think that, you know, I read a lot of book reviews, particularly the New York Times I really like, and Michio Kakutani is kind of a, you know, sacred person almost to
Yes,
most
if
readers.
she rates a good book, you can be pretty sure it's a good book.
Yeah,
she has very high standards.
She's fantastic, yeah. But I also look for certain, you know, Pulitzer Prize winners, the Booker Prize winners. I look every year in the fall for the winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature. I think that's kind of the one that has been most carefully researched.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of information you got to put together to find those books that are really worthwhile reading.
I'm with you there. I mostly read the classics, that I don't read too many books by contemporary writers. But I do read some books by contemporary writers, and usually they are books that I've read about in the New York Times Book Review.
Yeah.
And if the Times has given it a good review, generally speaking, and if I feel that I can learn something about human nature, you mentioned that before, and myself, and if I'm learning about human nature, I'm learning about myself, then I'll go out and buy the book. I think the New York Times Book Review section and the Sunday Times Book Review is very valuable.
Oh yeah, but you know, searching for those good books, we're all different, we all have subjective taste, but you need some forum, some method, some structure to find the books. I mean, you can't go to a library, look at the cover and say, well, this is an interesting subject, I want to read this. Or even if you know the author,
Yeah.
mightn't be one of his or her better books. So you need a constant review of what's being said and what's being done.
I think it's unfortunate that there are probably a lot of people listening today who want to read good books and maybe haven't had much time over the years to read good books or whatever, and really are not familiar with which books might be worth reading. I don't know if when we went to school, went to high school, even college, maybe this is not true of college, but certainly high school, I don't know if teachers did enough to guide us as to what kinds of books might be worth reading. Maybe we should have been given lists of of some of the books that are considered classics, lists we could have held on to the rest of our lives.
Yeah, but you know, when you're college age or high school age, your interests are very much different than what they are today.
True
and
also.
A lot of people come out of college saying, God, I'm glad I'm through with those literary assignments. They made me read Tolstoy and Montaigne and the Greeks, and you know, I'm not interested in that. I want, you know, current day stuff. But as you reflect back on now, you wish you had some of those lists because you know your interests are more in tune with them. Those great authors, the classics, as you say, that have provided us with information about human nature and about ourselves that we're interested in today.
You know, you're reminding me of something. For those who are watching, there are two books I have read in recent years that are really good guides to the great books. You know, again, if you're looking for guidance as to what books might be valuable, again, in learning about oneself, others, life in general, and trying to acquire wisdom. Harold Bloom, who is professor emeritus at Yale and a very famous literary critic in America, he's about 80 years old, by the way. He wrote a book some years ago, about 10 years ago, as I recall, called The Western Canon. And what he does in this book is to tell the reader which writers he believes have been the finest writers in the history of Western civilization, and which specific books have been the best books ever written. My recollection is, in fact, I know this, I'm certain of this, he claims Shakespeare is the best of all the writers, and tells the reader which plays in particular are worth reading. I think, in fact, I know that he claimed that Hamlet and King Lear are the best works that Shakespeare ever did. But he also, again, provides real guides. Another book, before I forget, David Denby is a writer who, in his 40s, went back to Columbia University, from which he had graduated years ago, to retake courses in the great books. And as a result of his studying at Columbia for a year, as a middle-aged man, he wrote a book called The Great Books, in which he talks about what the professors at Columbia claim to be the great books, and he also gives you information from them, talks about classroom discussions about some of the great books. And I know you have read Denby's book, have you
Yeah,
not? The Great
yeah,
Books?
yeah.
Well worth reading. So that's another guide, The Great Books
Yeah.
by David Denby. How do you think you have profited from years of reading?
Oh, I think everybody that has done serious reading, that has, searched out the great authors and so forth, profit. As I said earlier, ultimately what we want to end up with is a better understanding of ourselves. Plato gave us that easy assignment, know thyself, what we thought was easy when we first heard it. But as we mature in life, we find it's extremely difficult. But if you read the classics and the great authors, those that have studied human nature and those that have had the capability of revealing it in exciting and interesting terms, we're going to know more about human nature, and we're going to know more about ourselves, because we don't know anything about ourselves unless we know how we compare with human nature. So the great minds contribute the other half of the puzzle. We're struggling to learn something about ourselves, and they're telling us, well, human nature has these capabilities and these problems and so forth. How do we rate in that category? And that's what good reading has done for us.
This also reminds me, the ancient Greeks believed the key to wisdom was knowing oneself.
Oh, yeah.
We know on one of the very famous temples in ancient Greece, they inscribed the words, know thyself.
Yeah.
And people like Plato, and by the way, Professor Bloom believes Plato rates among the top 2 or 3 writers of all time. So again, for those of you who are not avid readers and are looking for a writer well worth reading, Plato. In fact, and Plato, one of the advantages of reading Plato over Shakespeare, by the way, Plato is much easier to read than Shakespeare. But yeah, I think we all have a curiosity about ourselves, whether we know it or not, a certain nosiness, about, to use that word, nosiness. And my guess is people also have whether they realize, great curiosity about their wives, their children, their friends. And I think if people think they're going to watch some television program like Larry King and find out about human nature, I think generally speaking they'll be disappointed. But if they read the great books, if they read Tolstoy and Plato and Dostoevsky, Mark Twain, they're going to find out an awful lot about themselves as well as other people.
Yeah, it's good to learn early in life that it's difficult to understand human nature. It takes a tremendous amount of time and effort, and you got to be guided and led in the right directions to get information that's going to be helpful for you to understand human nature and yourself. And to think, like you said, you're going to find it on television, you're going to go to social clubs and find it on the golf course or playing basketball.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen. You got to search it out, and it's hard work. And that's why I don't want us to sound like elitists going back to the classics and the New York Times and stuff like that. But they're a good source of directing us into that long, hard study of trying to understand human nature and ourselves.
A bell just went off in my head based on something you said. Some people think, well, if they play golf with their best friend or go jogging with their best friend, they might learn something about human nature. And I think they might.
Oh, yeah.
We learn
Little
a lot
rubs
from
off,
each other.
sure.
But I think this. I think there's no substitute for books for a reason Thoreau gave. Thoreau said the great books can tell us what our friends and relatives can't tell us or won't tell us. Again, Thoreau. Great books can tell us what our friends and relatives can't tell us or won't tell us. Let me go with the won't for a moment.
Yeah.
I think the fact of the matter is that all of us in conversations, even with people we love, are sometimes inhibited, that we are reluctant to express some of our innermost ideas, that Phil might be reluctant to tell Dan what he's really thinking about something, thinking Dan might think Phil's weird, or etc. But when you read the great books, the writers are much freer than our relatives and friends to tell us what they really think. Not to mention, the great writers generally are far more insightful people than we are. The great writers know me better than I know me.
Sure.
And so that when you're reading the great books, again, it can satisfy our curiosity in the sense that so often they're telling us things about ourselves and others and life that we'll get from no one else.
Yeah, there's only a couple of hundred people throughout the centuries, and we go back, 3,000 years of literature, there's only a couple of hundred people who really have that capability of understanding deeply human nature and in all its complexities, in all of its mysteries, and delved into it and got into it deeply. And Shakespeare, you mentioned before, probably got in more deeply and felt more comfortable in that, in the depths of human
He's a supreme psychologist.
understanding. And those are the people we have to tap and say, hey, help me out. I don't understand this. I feel this, and I have this relationship problem, and so forth and so on. What did the Greeks do about it? What are they doing in the Renaissance? What did Tolstoy and Dostoevsky say? And you find it out only by getting into their literature, getting into understand them.
You know what's also interesting about reading? It's a solitary activity.
Yeah.
But I don't ever remember feeling lonely when I was alone reading.
Yeah.
And again, even though it's a solitary activity, it doesn't isolate us from other people, but rather has the contrary effect, in the sense that when we read great books, we become better connected not only to ourselves, but others. We become better connected to people because we then understand them better. And I like the word you used before to describe human nature. Each of us is infinitely complicated. In fact, one of the ways in which bad movies differ from really good movies is that in bad movies, he's evil, she's good, he rides the white horse, he rides the black. You know. Whereas, Tolstoy, one of the masters at understanding human nature, Tolstoy said that it would be inaccurate to say that somebody is good or somebody is evil. It would be inaccurate to say that somebody is kind or unkind. He said it would be inaccurate to say that one person is intelligent and another is stupid. And he went on to explain why. He said each of us encompasses all those characteristics. So that Phil at times is wise, at times I'm a fool. Yeah. At times I'm kind, at times I'm unkind. And I think one of the benefits of reading great literature is, again, it helps us to understand how complex we all are.
Oh yeah, has to be the primary point. We can only scratch the surface on our own, unless we're another Shakespeare or Dostoevsky or whoever. We can only scratch the surface. We need the kind of help that the great minds can provide us. And you mentioned it being a solitary activity. This allows us to open up. We're around a family table. We're a little reluctant to open up, or in a social group, or in a golf foursome, whatever, jogging together. You got to be a little careful who you're talking to and what you say. Everything has to be prepared and said properly. But when you're reading, you get into it. You open your mind and soul and heart and everything else. And the deepest feelings that most people have ever had the joy of experiences have been through reading. I mean, how many people remember television shows they saw 20 or 30 years ago, or movies, or whatever? But books, I mean, they leave lasting impressions, deep, lasting impressions. You can only get it, I think, from the great books.
Yeah, I'm very much with you. On this subject of how might we profit from reading, a book I want to recommend to the viewers is a book, again, by Harold Bloom, that the Yale professor I alluded to before. He wrote a book called How to Read and Why. How to Read and Why. Let me just spend 60 seconds going down some of his observations about what we can get from reading good books and great books. He says this, and some of this is a little bit repetitious. Good writers give us insights into our problems and how we can deal with them. Good books help us to understand ourselves, others, and life. And also, as I mentioned before, he says reading is a solitary activity, but in contrast to isolating ourselves, it brings us closer to others because it enhances our understanding of others. He also mentions Montaigne in one of his books. Montaigne is one of my favorite writers. He's also one of Bloom's favorite writers. Montaigne said the best companion he had in life, and he wrote this towards the end of his life, were books. The best companion. He compared books to relationships, and he was married, by the way, to the same woman for many years, and to sex. And from what we know about Montaigne, he had a pretty active sex life. But towards the end of his life, he came to the conclusion that books beat relationships and beat sex, that, again, it was the chief source of satisfaction, he said, in his life. Some people might find him weird in coming to that conclusion, but he did. One other observation. David Denby, I mentioned before, he's written a book called The Great Books, and Denby says this: great literature helps us to think more clearly, and since so much of life consists of thinking, it's going to help us to live better. I mean, think about that, how much of our lives focuses on thinking. It's almost impossible indeed for us to stop thinking when we are awake. And if it's true that reading can help us to think better, well, then it's going to impact in a very positive way on our lives. One other comment before I ask Dan for some book recommendations, and I'll be making some. Noam Chomsky, the famous linguist, has said this: we will probably always learn more about ourselves from novels than from science. Almost always learn more about ourselves from novels, great novels, of course, than from science. One other observation. I can't resist this. I'm looking at the clock here to see how much time we have. In many of our conversations in recent years, we've talked about the internet.
Yep.
And we used to go to see a lot of films together, especially in the city. James Salter, rather good contemporary writer, underrated in some
Very
ways.
much so, yeah.
Yeah. He has compared watching films and accessing the internet to reading good books. And here's the conclusion, again, James Salter has come to, and I think this is kind of illuminating. He laments people living on a diet of film, TV, and the internet for this reason. He says that film, TV, and the internet cannot provide the soul food that good books can provide. I like that expression, soul food. Let's get to some book recommendations now. I had asked you prior to the program if you could recommend a couple of books to people who aren't avid readers, then a couple of books to those who are.
Okay, well, let me start out by saying a lot of people aren't avid readers because they're afraid of reading. They've had experiences in high school and college where they detest the literary assignments and they were assigned to read Shakespeare plays and things like that, and did them, but forced themselves and never did well on them. And to those people, I would say, well, you know, you were 18, 20, 22 years old at that time. You're a little older now, a little more mature. Don't let that bad experience stop you from looking into just those same assignments that you had when you were in high school and college. And I'm thinking of, you know, if you mention to them, you know, Tolstoy wrote that great adventure love story, War and Peace, in addition to others. Oh no, that book's too big. It's just the size of it scares me. And you know, I'd never liked literature in college anyway. I always had trouble with that. But this is not, you know, something that's very difficult. It's something that's on your level. It's on our level. It's on most people's level. And once you get into a book like that, it's extremely capturing. It draws you in, so you don't want to put it away for a while.
So you're suggesting even if somebody isn't an avid reader,
yeah,
you're recommending War and Peace.
I'm recommending War and Peace. I'd recommend Stendhal's the Black and the Red, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, who else now? Victor Hugo. I mean, there's so many others.
Marcel Proust?
Yeah. Proust, yes. Proust a little more difficult. But most of the authors that I've mentioned, and the classics, and if people have read them for decades and centuries in some cases, most of that is accessible to the average reader. The guy can get through a newspaper, he can get into something, and then be captured by that something.
Let's talk about Tolstoy.
Okay.
So many literary critics believe Tolstoy may well have been the greatest novelist who ever lived. Most of his novels are pretty long. Books like War and Peace. War and Peace is considered by some to be the best novel ever written, but it is about 1,400 pages. Anna Karenina, well worth reading. Resurrection is a shorter book. But let me recommend a book by Tolstoy, again, to people who may not be avid readers and who don't want to read a long book. As far as I know, the shortest novel that Tolstoy ever wrote, and it's a great book. I just recently reread it. It's called The Death of Ivan Ilyich. The Death of Ivan. It's only about 165 pages. It's a book about a middle-aged man who is dying. And he looks back on his life and how he lived his life. And he comes to the conclusion that he had the wrong values, that his life was not as satisfying as it could have been because his priorities were not right, because he lacked perspective. Now that he's dying, he's gaining some perspective. So even though the book is about a man who is dying, it's really about life. This book has acquired real meaning for me right now. About 4 months ago, I was diagnosed with a possible life-threatening illness, although I'm doing well right now. And what I've been doing recently is reading books I thought would help me cope with my illness and my mental state. And The Death of Ivan Ilyich is just a great book. Another short book, again, for non-avid readers, people who maybe want to become an avid reader, want to begin a reading, a book called Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. Siddhartha is loosely based on the life of the Buddha. It's a book about a man's quest for wisdom, Siddhartha. And one final book, since we're running short on time here. It's a book I've talked about a lot in previous programs, and it's a book most of us were assigned in high school, but it's worth rereading if you haven't already read it. Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, an American classic. Now, with regard to the avid readers who are watching.
Okay, with the avid readers, I would again go back to their college days. They were assigned Shakespeare and usually hated it. And they read, oh, we had King Lear and Hamlet and Macbeth, and oh, it was terrible. I hated the assignments and so forth and so on. Go back and reread them as a mature person with a mature mind, and you'll get a lot out of those works.
I very much agree. So when you read Plato or Tolstoy at age 45, even 35, it has much more meaning than at age 15 because of our life experiences.
Reread it every 10 years if you can. I mean, War and Peace, I've gotten to know Natasha and Andre like their family because, you know, it's a lovely story. It's a great story. But the Greeks also, Homer, Aeschylus, Euripides, Sophocles, hated the assignments in school, love them now.
We're running short on time, and I knew we would only get to maybe two of the 8 questions I wanted to ask you. Next time we get together, we're going to talk about wisdom.
Good.
What you think constitutes wisdom, and I will challenge some of your ideas, perhaps,
Sure.
or comment on them. And also, I'll bring in some ideas from some of the great thinkers on what they believed constituted wisdom. Dan, again, I thank you very much. We're going to get together again soon. Thank you.
Enjoy being here.
Okay. As usual, I'd like to end with a quotation from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau in Walden, his masterpiece, another book, by the way, I want to highly recommend, Walden. He says we're all artists. And here's a quote from the book in which he explains himself. He said that to affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts.